The remainders are a mix of occupied during the prehistoric time and occupied during the historic times. Okay, I'm going to have to change gears for a second. All right, one of these are some of the issues we've run into trying to research the history and archaeology of Mulberry Island. First thing, and any of you that have done genealogy or historical research involving Newport News or its predecessor, Warwick County, or anything really in Virginia, may have come across this term. It is a burned record county. That means the county records were burned. Not every burned record county in Virginia had its courthouse burned and looted during the American Civil War. Warwick County actually did. So in 1861, the records were burned and destroyed, most of them. So that makes doing things like finding deeds and wills and things like that, the sort of raw material of history, destroyed or mostly destroyed for Warwick County, now the city of Newport News. So that's one of the big issues. Even though we don't have a whole lot of records before 1870, we still can find specific individuals and particular events that are of interest to people. And some of the ones that we've come across are, we have a Confederate earthwork called Fort Crawford. We have found the receipts filled out by the Confederate Army for the enslaved men that were rented. They rented them to build the earthworks. And so we have receipts for that. In fact, my colleague at the Lee Hall Mansion Museum, which is right up the road from Fort Eustis, has gone through some of these records, and several of the men that were enslaved at Lee Hall were brought over to Mulberry Island to work on the fortifications. We encountered a raid records in the Virginia Gazette, which is the newspaper of 18th century Virginia, and there was a raid on a plantation led by what I think is Lord Dunmore's regiment, which was and I'll talk about this a little later, but that mentioned some specific people and led us to research a little more, and we started to find individuals who had lived on Mulberry Island in the 18th century. And then of course, if you've done much of this kind of work, the census is just a great source of things, and so we'll talk a little about the census. All right, now, that's just a little background. We'll now get into the actual history. For folks that haven't seen this image before, this is Captain John Smith's map of Virginia, dates around 1612. For those of you who are confused by its orientation, north goes that way. So the Chesapeake Bay looks really strange because it's on its side. This is the first map image that shows Mulberry Island I've been able to find, and this is a close-up of Captain John's map. Mulberry Island's right here. If you're familiar with the area, we'll jump over this way. If you're familiar with this area, you know Jamestown. And then as you come down the river, you get Hog Island over in Surrey County. And then the river bends, and that's Mulberry Island. So that's the first map reference I've seen to it. One of the things that's important to note on that map is Mulberry Island is empty. John Smith did record on his map large native towns. Right here is Kiskiak. Kiskiak is on what's now the Yorktown Naval Weapons Station. Werowocomoco, which was the capital of the Powhatan Chiefdom, is just off the map here. It's over in Gloucester. And then Kecoughtan is down here somewhere, just off this map. So we don't have one of those big towns on Mulberry Island. All of our native sites seem to be used for fairly short-term occupation. People didn't live in the same place for years and years. What they would do is they would stop at a place and come back every year. So, okay. Mulberry Island. I get asked why is it called Mulberry Island periodically. Mulberry trees were important to the early English because when they first came to Virginia, they had no idea how they were going to make any money. Their plan was to find something like the Aztec Empire, because that had worked for the Spanish in Mexico. They showed up, there was a city, it was full of gold, they took it over, they got all the gold, they went home, very happy. The English show up with roughly the same plan. They don't find any cities, they don't find any gold, they don't know what they're going to do to make money, so they try a bunch of different things. They thought they could make silk. Silk is made from silkworms. Silkworms live on mulberry trees. By having mulberry trees, they thought they could grow silk, and then they wouldn't have to buy silk from the Chinese. That did not work. What did eventually work, after about 10 or 12 years, right, the English show up in 1607, they don't really figure out how to make any money until about 1618, 1619, when they start growing tobacco. They start growing tobacco. In order to grow tobacco, you need farms, you need land. They spend the time pushing off the natives. In 1622, the natives attack, kill a third of the colonists, and cause, indirectly, the bankrupting of the Virginia Company of London, the private corporation that ran the colony of Virginia from 1607 to 1624. It goes bankrupt in 1624 and gives the colony of Virginia to the English government, the British Crown. Being a government, and therefore chock full of bureaucrats, the government says, what do we get? What have we? So they get in a boat and they send people over to Virginia to count stuff up. And so they create a document that's referred to as the Muster of 1624. It's a census. And this is an example of the kind of information that people would collect. And so I will just sort of skim it, but this is the muster for Thomas Chapman. Thomas Chapman had arrived in Virginia on the trial in 1610, and his wife had arrived in 1619 on the good ship George. They have a 2-year-old son named Thomas. They have a 6-week-old girl named Anne. They have 5 bushels of corn, about 50 pounds or half a hundredweight of fish. They have a pound of gunpowder. They have 10 pounds of lead to make bullets. They have 1 piece, either a musket or, in some cases, a cannon. They have some armor, so he's got like a hat or a breastplate. They have 1 cow. They have 14 chickens or ducks, or chickens and ducks. And they have a house. So that's a lot of information for somebody who's been dead 400 years.
It is.
Now, the muster did come to Mulberry Island. The English settled on Mulberry Island in about 1619. And so the muster comes and the people on Mulberry Island are identified. There were 13 households identified in 1624 on Mulberry Island and 30 people. And there's a list of them. If you're in red, you are an indentured servant. You are, because what these things did is they would take the master of the house and then list him, and then list everybody else's relationship to him. So, master of the house, his wife, their servants, children, whatever. So on this list, if you are red, you are an indentured servant. If you are in black, you are the head of the house or the head of the house's wife. The long list of red is probably, well, we think it's a farm run by a man named William Pierce. Captain Pierce lived in Williamsburg. He owned land on Mulberry Island. He owned about 1,000 acres. He sent these people out to work his farm. There's a man and a wife. If you're in a box, that's a married couple. So the Atkins, Richard and Abigail, I think, are running Captain Pierce's farm. So they're there, and then everybody else is an indentured servant working for Captain Pierce. You then have the Virgos, man and wife team, all by themselves, out in the woods trying to grow tobacco. The Woods, Percival and Anne. The Barhams, Barham, Anthony and Elizabeth. And then, this just intrigues me, the Harwoods. Thomas Harwood and Grace Harwood have an indentured servant. He is Thomas Reed, and in 1624 he was 65 years old. I have no idea why a 65-year-old guy would come to Virginia in the first place. And I have no idea why somebody would hire him for 7 years. There's clearly more to that story. And the question is, can we find it? Will the records let us find that? And then all the other ones are just guys out in the woods trying to make a little farm. One of the things what documents can be confusing and can sometimes be misleading. The muster says that there are no houses on Mulberry Island. You saw the muster I showed you before listed house. There are no houses listed on Mulberry Island. So either all of these people are not living in houses, or, more likely, I think, the people assessing the things didn't think it was a house. They're like, yeah, you may live in it, but it's not a house. It's a shack. It's a something. Because there is archaeological evidence of buildings and structures from this time period built by the English. So it's one of those cases where the documents, and if you do a lot of historical research, the documents are somewhat misleading. So you got to think about what was the person who's writing the documents thinking about. There. Okay, so this has come up when is the first time we find Africans in Mulberry Island in the area. And this early in American history, people that are listed as black are most likely directly from Africa. It's only after several generations do you start to think about them as African American. Because if they caught you in Africa and brought you over, it's a direct thing for the first 10 or 15 years. In 1624, nobody on Mulberry Island is listed as African. There are 23 people listed as African in the entire muster. And if you think about it, in 1624, that's 5 years after the first boat bearing Africans arrives at Jamestown, which is 1619. So there doesn't seem to be a large population at this very early time. By the end of the 17th century, there are many, many more people of color, Africans and African Americans, who are in the area. But one of the things that needs to be kept in mind is the rules of labor and sort of racial categories are in flux through the 17th century. And there's a legal case, York County, which is that's the next county over from Newport News. During the Civil War, they were taking their records to go to Richmond to be safe, and of course Richmond burned. They hid them instead, so York County has all their records. And because of that, you can do a lot of things in York County you can't do other places. This is a court case, this is a reference to a court case in 1675, in which Philip Gowan is suing John Lucas for his freedom. Philip is listed in the records as the son of Mahel Gowan, and Mahel, is noted in the records as a free man of color. So the fact that Philip could sue means that he has a certain amount of legal standing. And the case was decided in his favor. The question became, after he entered into, if I remember this correctly, he entered into a contract to do work for a fellow as an indenture. At the end of the contract, he said, I gave you my 6 years or whatever, I'm done. And the fellow said, no, you're a slave, I own you forever. And so that idea of how long somebody could control your labor and would it pass on to your children becomes a very important question, and one that is settled to a great extent by the end of the 17th century. So by 1690 in Warwick County, there are enough people that are categorized as enslaved that the people that enslaved them are now worried about slave revolts. And there are all sorts of petitions going to the state capital of Jamestown saying, we're worried about a slave revolt here in Warwick County. So that means they now have classified a whole bunch of people as slaves and are worried that they are not going to like it. All right. Okay, for the 7th century, most of the people that were brought to Mulberry Island and enslaved were working on tobacco plantations from the middle of the 17th century on to the end of the 17th century. By the beginning of the 18th century, the tobacco has killed much of the soil on Mulberry Island, and they have to transition to growing food. So they're growing wheat and corn and cattle and things like that they're selling to Richmond, to Williamsburg, to Norfolk, and in some cases to the Caribbean. Statistics. In 1775, the records indicate that over 60% of the total population of Warwick County was black. And then in 1782, 84% of all the households in Warwick County include one slave. So at least one slave. So you have a majority African American population, but almost every white household has at least one enslaved person. That's the Matthew Jones house. That's also the Matthew Jones house. One of our more significant historic properties is the Matthew Jones house. It's on Fort Eustis. It was built originally in about 1710. It was heavily modified and bricked in the 1720s, and then it was modified again in the 1890s. Mr. Jones died in 1728. He, luckily for me, not so much for him, he died in Isle of Wight County, and because he died in Isle of Wight County, and he owned stuff in Isle of Wight County, his will and what they call a probate inventory, which is a list of everything he owns, was all done in Isle of Wight County, which means it has survived. So we have a copy of Matthew Jones's will. In the will, he lists 19 enslaved people who he's giving away to his children. I have been a historian for an archaeologist for a really long time. It still is always jarring when you're reading a description of, I'm giving my property, my cows, my this, and Baba to my daughter. I find it jarring. These are the folks that Matthew Jones mentioned. Sam, Basco, Peg, Sis, Phyllis with an F, Frank, Child, Betty, Peg, Roger, Nance, Frank, a man, Liz, a girl, another Frank, Phyllis at Nottaway, Charity, Tomboy, Will, Jenny, and Sarah. So those are, I think that's all of them, but there are 19 people that the Jones family owned, and he's divvying them up. That's more enslaved people than was average for this area in the early 18th century. And when I did my dissertation work, I worked with the records in Elizabeth City County, it's now Hampton. And when you tallied up the value of the enslaved people versus everything else people owned, the enslaved people were about 30% of the value in the entire county. So you're talking a considerable monetary value on people in the 18th century. So, I mentioned at the beginning of this a raid on Mulberry Island during the War for American Independence, the American Revolution. This is an excerpt from the Virginia Gazette, and this is a shout out to the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. They have online all of the Virginia Gazettes, so you can look up Mulberry Island in the 18th century. You can just look for the entry for Mulberry Island, and you find stuff, and this is one of them. Last Wednesday night, some of Dunmore's banditti, about 12, mostly Negroes, came ashore and went to the house of Mr. Benjamin Wells at Mulberry Island. After threatening and abusing him in a most infamous manner, they robbed him of all his most valuable effects and carried off 2 Negro women. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Lord Dunmore, he was the last royal governor of Virginia. And during the War for American Independence, one of the things he said he did was he offered freedom to any enslaved person that would fight for the British crown. And he created something that was referred to in the 18th century, and it is either in the 18th century as the Ethiopian Regiment. I think that's what this is. I think this is an assault by members of the Ethiopian Regiment, who are referred to as Dunmore's banditti, right? Because the Gazette was on the side of the American Revolutionaries, and so anybody fighting for the crown is a bandit. And so Dunmore's banditti, I think, of the Ethiopian Regiment. And this strikes me as folks going to get family. They went and they got those 2 women. They're like, we're free, we're getting you. Why they didn't take all of them, I don't know. How many Mr. Wells owned, I don't know either. But that's, I think there's an event there. In thinking about Lord Dunmore's regiment and the Ethiopian Regiment and enslaved people that would go fight, would free themselves and go fight